voices, likeness, and/or images will not be captured by Barnard College. Written submission of questions may be shared during the Q&A portion of the event. Before we get started, I would be remiss not to mention the racial and political unrest taking place in our country as we speak and around the world this past weekend and continues today. I hope everyone did see President Byelock's letter to the community over the weekend, which strongly denounced the anti-Black violence and rhetoric that is currently unfolding across this nation. The Barnard community is dedicated to tackling the issues, and we are here to lift each other up in these difficult times. Programs like this are in fact essential to that work. With that, I'd like to begin by thanking the entire Alumni of Color Dinner Committee for their work throughout the year as we planned our annual celebration of diversity at Barnard. The Alumni of Color Dinner is something so many of us look forward to each year, and we truly miss seeing all of you. But while we are not able to come together in person this year, we are very thrilled to virtually host what would have been the keynote at this year's dinner. We have very special guests with us today, Ariana González-Stokas and Allegra Haynes, class of 1975. Ariana González-Stokas joined Barnard in July 2019, just last year, as the inaugural Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. In this role, Ariana leads strategic initiatives that cultivate a more inclusive and equitable learning environment. She also chairs the Council on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and works closely with the Dean of Faculty Diversity and Development and the Executive Director for Equity, among others, to envision and actualize programs that promote diversity, establish accountability, and support inclusivity among Barnard's community. Her previous roles include Dean of Inclusive Excellence at Bard College and Assistant Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Gutman Community College at the City University of New York, right here in Manhattan. She has a BA in Philosophy and Studio Arts from Bard College and a PhD in Philosophy and Education from Teachers College, Columbia University.
Apologies for that. And with us today is also Allegra Haynes. Allegra, or Happy, has devoted her entire professional life to serving the residents of Denver and is currently the Executive Director of Denver Parks and Recreation. Happy worked as an aide to Councilman Bill Roberts in 1979, and from 1983 to 1990 was an administrative aide to Federico Peña, the city's first Latino mayor. In 1990, she was elected to the Denver City Council, becoming the first African-American woman to serve on that body. She served on the council for 13 years and was the president from 1998 to 2000. Playing a key role in the development of Denver's new international airport and sponsoring initiatives to ban smoking in public buildings and supporting the introduction of a living wage. In October 2005, Happy joined Denver Public Schools as an assistant to the superintendent for community partnerships. In 2008, Governor Bill Ritter appointed Haynes to the Colorado Commission on Higher Education. She became the Chief Community Engagement Officer for Denver Public Schools in 2009. In 2011, she left the school district for a position with CRL Associates and was elected to the Denver School Board. Happy earned her bachelor's degree in political science at Barnard College in 1975, completed 2 years of law school at the University of Denver, and received a master's degree in public affairs from the University of Colorado, Denver. Happy is also one of the recipients of this year's Distinguished Alumni Award, which is given each year at reunion to alumni who personifies the ideals of excellence of a liberal arts education and who has achieved considerable public or professional distinction and recognition in her chosen field of endeavor. Happy, congratulations, and thank you to you and Ariana for joining us today. I now turn it over to our moderator, Patricia Merrick, Director of Alumni Relations.
Thank you, Seema and Glory Bell, and hello, everyone. I hope you and your families are well and healthy, and thank you for joining us today as we discuss women in power, especially during a crisis. We have time for audience questions, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer as many of them as we can. We've been planning this event over the course of the last month with COVID-19 as the focus. But with the protests and civil unrest that have been taking place around the world over the past week, it became clear that we needed to shift the focus of the conversation. Systemic racism and excuse me, and violence against people of color, particularly Black Americans, is not a new phenomenon. But especially in the context of a global pandemic, these inequalities are magnified and brought to the forefront for everyone to face. Surely these are difficult times, and many of us are looking towards leaders of all stripes to guide us: community leaders, political leaders, movement leaders. There is uncertainty in many aspects of our lives right now, but one trend that is noticeable is that women are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. From the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement to the sheer percentage of frontline workers confronting the pandemic that are women, to the countries with the strongest pandemic responses having women holding the positions of power. So with that, I want to turn to our panelists. Ariana and Happy, thank you for speaking with me today. Leadership in a crisis situation is very different from leadership in times of relative calm. After fighting for a seat at the table for so long, and with inequality still at play, especially for women of color, what does it mean for women to be able to wield their power at this moment in time? Ariana, let's start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Patricia and Gloria Bell and Seema. I'm really happy to be here. I was really looking forward, before I answer the question, to meeting so many alums at the Young Alum of Color dinner. So I know that many of you are out there. I can't see you, but I really look forward to the opportunity to meet you and hear about your experiences at Barnard and your ideas for what you would like to see happen and what you think needs to happen at the institution. So I think that obviously in this moment, we are in this very moment, an incredibly unprecedented time. Not unprecedented in how the time has revealed the depth of systemic inequality and systemic racism. I think that the United States, as many of us know, is a country that has been founded on such logic, such ways of knowing and behaving. And what we see is right now, I would argue, a laying bare in some ways. I think what leadership in this moment, leadership in crisis, is honest leadership, leadership that is unafraid of making authentic moves, but moves that are have a great deal of conviction. I think that right now, conviction is incredibly important. I think that radical care and interdependency are also qualities in leadership that we need pretty desperately. I think we need leaders who can show us how to practice radical care of others across difference, how to take responsibility for one another, even if you don't know one another, and really foster interdependency. I would say that we do have largely an overwhelming ethos of individual success at the expense of community or collective well-being or community success, whatever success is defined as for you. So, you know, I think that women or people who identify as women or identities that have been on the margins in leadership have always had to find opportunities, meaning opportunities haven't always been given for leadership. It has meant having to navigate through a system that may not have been designed for you. I think it also has meant making structures and new systems, or elevating ones that have been ignored or suppressed or marginalized. Reminding people of the history that exists, of long legacies of women and other marginalized groups and identities, finding ways to lead. And those ways to lead have not been for celebrity or for self. And I think examples, obviously, we'll talk a little bit about some of these examples that Happy and I maybe look to, exemplars in these moments from history, a little more in this conversation.
Thank you. Happy, same question. What does it mean for women to be able to wield their power right now?
This is where the phrase "now more than ever" becomes so relevant. And we know from history, it is moments like this, periods of dislocation and chaos, when women make the greatest strides towards independence, gaining authority, and opportunity. And there's so many examples in history of how women have stepped to the plate. And it's important for our society. We are needed, and particularly women of color are needed for their unique perspectives that they bring to the table. As Ariana said, it's based on a very practical sense of getting things done, doing what's needed. And it really is based on a very different of power, recognizing the inequality that exists based on theories of power. And there's so much written in feminist theory about this, but theories of power that are based on domination rather than the collective good. It's the type of leadership that we excel in, as particularly as color, having been barred from many of the traditional seats of power. We learned how to wield that power in very different ways, and understanding that it is not power over, but power to, and empowering each other is the flip side of the coin about radical self-care and radical care of one another in order to make progress.
Mm-hmm. You both alluded to this, that when women kind of do well and have that power, their communities do well. So while difficult, this moment is also providing us with opportunities, right, to advance messages around institutional racism and inequalities. How have you seen your community responding, either to anti-Black violence, the COVID-19 pandemic, or both? Happy, we'll start with you this time.
Yeah, I think in many ways, and because of the past progress, we have women in seats of power, in places where they can make a difference, particularly at this time. And a focus on equity, this COVID crisis, has been a really important one. We've all known for forever, it's part of our existence, the disparities that exist in our communities, the higher rates of diabetes, the higher infant mortality rates, and all of those things are realities that we live every day. But during this crisis, individuals in my community have been able to use the power of their voices to shine a light on these inequities. So our Center for African American Health, Deidre Johnson, who's a new executive director there, has been sending out communications that are really gaining traction around the disparate outcomes of the COVID crisis, and sharing the maps of our city that showed the disparities. As a result, our own local health department has picked that up as an important theme as we follow the guidance of our health department on what needs to be done and the decisions that are being made in our community. Another young woman, Kim Desmond, and Tatiana Neves, who are part of our diversity and innovation, have inserted an equity framework that are being made in our emergency operations center on a daily basis. So because of those women being in those seats of power, so to speak, they've been able to influence both the recognition of what's going on, the recognition of the disparities, but more importantly, to influence the way that this city is proceeding in responding to the crisis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Ariana, do you have examples you'd like to share?
I think that there are so many examples. I think that's one of the things that's important to stay focused on in this moment is there are many, many people, many leaders. I mean, the number of organizations committed to examining why we need to look at police budgets in communities, for instance, why we need to think about disproportionate funding, why funding is allocated more towards police rather than schools or hospitals or other types of mental health services. I think that research is powerful, and it can be powerful. I think research is sometimes criticized as being hiding away in the ivory tower. But I think that in this moment, we have so many examples of people who, like Happy mentioned, are using the power of data or research to show what systemic racism looks like, how it's exerted, both in policy and in practice. It isn't something that happens by accident. And I think that really identifying these various projects, Barnard itself has many scholars and people doing amazing work in these areas. I think many folks know the Barnard Center for Research on All Women. Their project right now, Interrupting Criminalization, is one that I would just draw attention to. Andrea Ritchie and Miriam Kaba are two incredibly intellectual and practical presences to have at the institution right now because they're there doing some research. Miriam Kaba, I would say for people, if they don't know her work, to really look her up. And I think one of the things I've admired about her work for so long is that she really emphasizes the need for imaginaries. The idea that some of what we confront right now in our society is we need to have new imaginaries for what the future can be, what we can collectively make. And that opens the door to artists, to all kinds of activities that we need in order to conceive of a new and possible world beyond racism and beyond injustice and inequity.
Do you have any conclusions that you've discovered through this research that could inform our collective response? Or are there any cautionary notes that you can share or lessons learned so far that we should keep in mind?
Is that for me?
Yep, sorry.
Okay. In terms of higher ed or sort of in general, in terms of leadership?
Either one.
Okay. I think that working across difference is hard. Working across difference with conviction is hard. Saying, I have very strong beliefs about how I think the world should be and what I think needs to happen. And being confronted with folks who don't necessarily share that viewpoint. How do you bridge that? I think is something that, I definitely don't have the answer to. Something that in my own career has been very hard. Because injustice and inequality sometimes feels as if there is no middle ground. And how do you gather people to work in the service of equity, equality, justice? How do you get folks who've never thought about or noticed systemic racism? How do you get them to begin to engage with it, see that it affects them? So I think that work of building a community, right? We use that word a lot.
Yeah.
But community is, what is the common purpose? And how you have a shared purpose is about who you're in relation to, who you feel responsible for. And that's not fast work, I would say. That's slow work. And we often want things very fast. And right now we're in a moment of real acceleration. Mm-hmm. It's a bit disorienting on how do you do that work in a moment where everything feels like it's accelerating.
Happy, have you come across any cautionary notes? Did we lose Happy?
She might be
Frozen. All right, we'll give her a chance to kind of
Reboot.
there. Yep. You know, something that you mentioned actually in one of our previous conversations was around equity slippage, in terms of like how different communities are impacted, right? Who loses power first, if you will, who loses all those rights first. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I mean, I think right now there's some good folks writing about it, not just in terms of higher ed, but in terms of like, so in the last however many years, you know, we've seen an explosion of like diversity, equity, and inclusion jobs, both in higher ed, but also in the corporate sector. And, you know, that's a legacy of multicultural affairs and other, a long legacy of this work stemming out of affirmative action. But I think what's important is that if right now higher ed or a corporation or an organization views diversity as something additional or something extra, it's in danger of being cut, those positions being eliminated. Like even there's some kind of conversation in higher ed right now that departments that are Black studies or ethnic studies being seen as sort of as not core departments, and that those are the departments that first start to get funding drawn away. So I think that just in terms of like the diversity and inclusion types of offices or positions or efforts, if organizations see them as extra and not actually integral to the functioning of what they do, then in these types of moments, they are very much in danger of both, you know, layoffs or those budgets being cut or I think being impacted. Versus really realizing that right now, particularly in a time of like of a pandemic, more than ever, there should be folks with equity mindedness and lenses at the table. You know, because I think in New York City right now, the mayor just appointed a chief equity officer for contact tracing, right? I think that's a really good example of realizing contact tracing and not having a lens of equity has a potential to just continue what the disproportionate impact that this pandemic has had on people of color and low-income people. So I think these are moments that really test commitment and test our understanding of how integral we really believe those terms to be to the fabric and functioning of any organization.
Happy, thank you for coming back. We were just discussing the idea of equity slippage that Ariana brought up at our last conversation.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, I think that's a huge worry, and I think of the progress we've made and the gains we've made in the past, and I look at our state legislature, for example, where we have the highest number on record of Black and Latino legislators who are able to make significant change. But they're reelected every 2 years. And the political dynamics that we face in one election cycle, you know, we could be back at 2 or 3 of those individuals. And it's all the more important why they need to make the important changes that they can while they hold those seats, and that they look to the solutions that they find as long-term systemic changes, so that don't come and go with political whims. Ariana was talking about the bridging and how important that is, and it is something that we do have the power to do. I was reading from Sherry Moraga in the writings by radical women of color and this is back in 1984. And she said, we have to all the time, our reality is we have to bridge in the contradictions in our experience. We're colored women in a feminist movement. We're feminists among people in our own cultures. We are often lesbians among the straight. So we have to do this bridging by keeping track of ourselves, naming ourselves, telling our stories in our own words, and not being afraid to raise our voices and speak to the truth. So speaking to the truth is the critical power that we do have as a community. And part of my fear is this is what many of our folks are doing in the streets all across this country. And it's an important voice. I mean, we had 400 or 500 people lying down on the street in Denver for the 9 minutes that reflected that act of brutality a week ago. And that's a powerful voice. And we cannot be afraid to use it. But we have to make sure that we don't slip into misunderstanding the dynamics of power, I think, that I mentioned early on. That when young people are in the streets trying to battle with police, not recognizing that this isn't about domination or gaining power over another, it's about changing the definition of power and being doubly focused on that outcome as we move forward. We will lose some people in offices, we will gain people elsewhere. And I will say that, you know, our lessons in history are perfect examples of that. The two that came to my mind were Fannie Lou Hamer and Dolores Huerta. Neither of them had elected offices, but in moments of crisis in their own time, in the 60s and in the 70s, each woman from a totally unknown place, out of necessity, Dolores, you know, with families who were toiling in the fields of California, and Fannie Lou Hamer in the heart of Mississippi, who had both said enough is enough. And on behalf of our families, we have to stand up. So they demonstrated that non-traditional ideas of power, using organizational theory, using advocacy, using other methods to wield power is a way to move forward. And those two women made a significant difference in the history of our country by being willing, by having the courage, the kind of courage that Malala demonstrated, you know, when she said, I had a choice to make, to be killed or to raise my voice and then be killed. And not all of us are called to put our lives on the line, but we are called to make courageous decisions about using our voices as a tool of power.
So, you know, the need for vigilance is forever. What's the key to holding the line?
Well,
Ariana or Happy?
Go ahead, Happy.
I think it is, you know, what are the words, you know, keeping our eyes on the prize. We can never become comfortable. We can never become complacent. We have to stay vigilant. As Sherry Moraga said, we have to keep doing that bridging constantly. The contradictions that are inherent. Patricia Hill Collins talks about it as recognizing that we live two experiences, that we experience white domination, but on the other hand, we have an individual and group evaluation of independent African American consciousness, and that is something that is ours and ours alone. It's the same in our Latino communities. We have our consciousness as a culture, as a people, And we have to hold on to that to help drive our paths forward and to make sure that we don't forget and that we don't lose our way in the midst of chaos. And that's what we face today.
Ariana?
I think it's a hard question. I think that because it's a hard question, I think because vigilance, the word, implies kind of a constant tension. And I'm conscious of the toll that that constant tension has had and has on women and people who identify as women over many generations. About how to hold vigilance, how to hold space without the exhaustion and the kind of lack of space that you then have for sometimes yourself, because you are constantly in a struggle. So it's something that I think about a lot, and I follow this person on Instagram right now called, it's called the Nap Ministry. And her project, she's a performance artist, and I tell everyone about her because she has this tagline that says, "Justice is a space to rest." And her other tagline is, "Rest is reparation." And, you know, she talks about the project as a way in which to honor her ancestors who never had an opportunity to rest. So, you know, I don't know the answer of kind of what eternal vigilance looks like, which is that the struggle is far from over. The struggle meaning the struggle to hold leadership, to be seen for who you are, to create a more just space within which to rest. So I think it's one of those questions that I don't know yet the answer to it. I do know that it's not alone, and it can't be alone. And one of the best examples that we have is that it is in coalition, it is in collectivity, it is in community. And the sort of ethos that we have of the kind of still celebrity activist who is doing it alone, all of us, many of us know that that isn't the way. It's not, nothing will change if that's the way. So the eternal vigilance is what we do together and how we decide to do that work together. And it's only together that it can be done.
Well, with that, we actually have a few questions from the audience, so I will read them to you. So Dr. Marilyn Mobley says, wonderful to see you both. Congratulations, happy. Are you both aware of states like mine in Ohio that have declared racism a public health crisis? Any comments on such a move?
Good for Ohio is what I could say. You know, again, our lived existence for, but I think it's powerful, just like the, you know, the equity frameworks that we're using. Naming the challenge that we all face, that our society faces, is so important. And I will use an example. In Denver Public Schools, we were creating our new strategic plan, and we took a lot of heat for addressing what the concerns were for our young people and their lack of progress squarely around the issues of race and defining the metrics for our organization in terms of race. And it is so important to name it. That is the first step towards taking action. It is to name it. And so kudos to the leaders in Ohio. We should follow suit across the country. Again, I think that would be a very great first step towards taking action and perhaps for some healing.
All right. Happy, as a female leader and as a woman of color, what has been the most significant barrier in your career?
I think it has been people not recognizing that leadership styles are different, that, the traditional male, hard driving type A, aggressive position as a leader is not a sign of weakness, that being someone who's a collaborator, who listens, who exercises what Ariana discussed just a little while ago. It's collective power is what gives us power. And that has been hard over the years, because it isn't recognized often as something that's important to do. And yet here we are today. I mean, I was just reading a McKinsey report that defines now the qualities of leadership are exactly the kinds of things that women are good at, around communication, around collaboration, and listening carefully and hearing what people's needs are. So I think we're at the right time, in a place in time, to be able to use these skills that are unique to women, and even more unique for women of color, because of our it's not multilingual, but our multicultural. We live in the two worlds that I've mentioned before, and being able to use those skills to effectively communicate.
Ariana, I think this one was meant for you. How do we shield such programs from being cut? How can we support you and other equity officers?
I think it's, again, about people in positions of leadership too, being very clear that when it comes to people are in positions right now of needing to make cuts, and it's very painful. And I think as long as leadership has a very clear idea that diversity or ethnic studies departments, or, if you choose to cut those, it sets back an organization, right? It isn't an extra or an other. So I think being a strong advocate, if you're not in a position of leadership or decision-making around those, for helping others understand that these are essential functions, not extra functions. And I think right now we can look at, even in New York City, even at Barnard, the vast majority of essential workers, if we're just talking about diversity, are people of color, or people who come from underrepresented identities. So, and in the public health crisis, who is most disproportionately impacted? If your doctors and your nurses and your public health practitioners and your contact tracers don't all have an understanding of equity and diversity or intercultural communication, your contact tracing will fail if you don't have good intercultural communication skills, I would say, right? Because you're not going to be able to have a way in which to talk to a broad range of folks to help them understand the importance of what's happening. I don't just mean multilingual either. So I think it's about being a strong advocate, and knowing the reasons really well yourself, right? Knowing yourself that you've done the work internally to understand that this isn't extra. So those are all ways you could.
Okay, this is from Wendy Epstein. Thank you for your presentation. I feel that a break in the stronghold has had on all of our vast collective voices created an opportunity to move us to have a radical change in our nation. How do the panelists envision the response to the murder of Mr. Floyd during a pandemic become a catalyst for a more fundamental change in race, healthcare, return to a democratic republic with the rule of law, and address climate change? That's a lot.
I mean, I don't have an answer. I have a perspective, and I think that all of what we're seeing right now is interrelated in this country. I think what we're seeing right now are manifestations of a system which does not care for people. It doesn't care for people equally. It doesn't care for people well enough. And we deeply need a system and a country which exerts deep care and takes care seriously and provides resources for that care, whether it's healthcare, home healthcare aids, adequate resources in your community for mental health. I mean, even think about the aftermath when the pandemic ends. This has been extremely trying psychologically for so many people. Part of what we're seeing out on the street right now, I would argue, is collective grief, collective rage. So I think that a lot of it is interrelated. I think we have cultivated a society which has a great deal of economic precarity for the vast majority of people, and a lack of distribution of resources. And a lot of that lack and imbalance is also why we have such a deep impact on the environment. So I think we have to see the points of interrelation, and then we have to go at those points of interrelation quite strongly.
I would add, we have a lot to learn from both the pandemic and this most recent set of circumstances around this brutal murder, and how we respond as a community, as a nation. We've learned some things about our adaptability during this pandemic. We've learned some things about our reliance, as Ariana said, on our essential workers, and how suddenly the values of our community and what was kept us moving were in fact those essential workers who we, traditionally get overlooked. And I think it's an opportunity to really focus on that and to reinforce the importance of those roles in our community. It happened with our childcare workers. Without those individuals who tend to be, lower income, people of color, taking care of the people's children, the economy comes to a halt. And yes, we've seen out in the streets the collective rage and grief, but we need to see that channeled into, and this is where our leadership as women is more important than ever, because transforming that anger into constructive change. And so we think of, a success has always followed a tremendous struggle, sacrifice, a success, and then it leads to another round of the same. We can't sit still. And so it is really important for us to think about what are the next steps. How do we change the way we work, for example? How do we address the issues of the digital divide? Because as part of the pandemic, and everybody said, well, we can just work from home. It wasn't so easy. Our children can just learn from home. And our superintendent, a woman of color, a Latina woman, realized that she had to buy Chromebooks for every child in this district, because when they decided to close, they realized that the digital divide made some children not able to learn. And so it's taking action from the streets, like Dolores Huerta did. They did a strike. They brought the grape industry to its knees. But Dolores had to have negotiating skills to be able to negotiate a contract that made lives better. And that is the transformation. It's the next step. And so we need to be really focused on what are those next steps, both in terms of this healthcare crisis and also in terms of the racism that engulfs our law enforcement system in this country today.
So a few people asked similar questions. How do we ensure that good faith expressions of support from white allies are accepted and not automatically rejected? How can we build stronger coalitions among women of culture across races, cultures, and socioeconomic strata?
I think that it's an important question, and I think it's one that many people who identify as white struggle with, or people who are looking, who don't share an identity with a group that is struggling under injustice. You know, I think obviously the first answer is always look to yourself, look to your community. I think doing that deep internal work of understanding your own story and how your identity and your story positions you in relation to other races, other genders, because that kind of self-understanding is really the ground floor. Where are your points of privilege? Where are your points of pain? What is your story? I think storytelling, I think Happy mentioned it earlier, is extremely powerful. Many folks like to say they know what someone's story is, and they don't know. Whether that person is white or Black or Latinx, whatever the background of the person is, the story is always just, you know, a different story. Mm-hmm. So I think that building coalitions is also about relationality. What are the shared, like I said, those shared points of intersection? How do you show up and take responsibility? I think right now, I was just listening to Kinaga Yamahata Taylor, the author and academic who recently wrote Race for Profit, you know, talk about what we're seeing on the streets is actually a broad multiracial protesters. That class and socioeconomic experience is a large connector of many folks who we are seeing protesting at the moment. So I think finding what those points of intersection of responsibility are. What is your point of intersection with other people who do not share your identity? So like Happy mentioned, childcare work. How are you an advocate for better pay, benefits, full-time work, for caring professions? So I think there's many ways of showing up. The work though first has to be interrogating deeply of yourself. And I think looking at what your strengths are, you know, and I think remembering that people of color, in asking them what you should do, sometimes that's an added burden. So right now I have a group of friends and activists who are very frustrated that people keep asking them what they should do. So I think that, but there's also the need for deeper long-term interracial coalition building in our country that existed at some points in the civil rights movement in some ways. And there's a lot of work to be done there for many of us.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a difficult conversation. Yesterday, as I was standing in our Civic Center park, which was just horribly damaged during what I'm not calling protests, because I think it was chaos in the evening hours in Denver, and she was asking me what can we do? How do we address this, you know, the violence that she saw as a part of the protest? And I said exactly what you said, Ariana. You've got to have an internal conversation. I said, and these, not the protests, but many of the nighttime activities that have resulted in a lot of destruction in this town have been led by young white, you know, in quotes, allies. And, you know, what I've said is you need to let your children know that spray painting Black Lives Matter on public buildings is not a form of alliance. It's not a statement of how you're allied. Find those places where we do really have common experiences, and let's figure out how we prevent the situations from occurring. And I said, you didn't think when you created all this destruction in our town that the additional costs in this time when budgets are tight means that, you know, potentially people of color, people in low wage jobs are going to suffer the consequences of not thinking through what your strategy is. You know, burning down a nearby business because you're in the streets and you have rage means that a small business that provides jobs for people in the community is now lost. And so that is not the kind of behavior that demonstrates an alliance. It's unbridled rage, and we need more than that now. We need people who are going to use ingenuity and creativity, and who are going to look towards solutions. And that's where out of the midst of the crisis and the sacrifice, we need people who are looking for solutions in creative ways and looking beyond the traditional answers that we have.
I think we have time for one more question. So this one says, thank you both. Clearly, you both have so much wisdom to impart. Wondering what you would say to young people today who are in the midst of a pandemic and now seeing these tragic racial events unfold. How do you help them to continue to have hope, to fortify them so that they can believe they can make a difference? And in parentheses, it says, I'm a school teacher.
I always turn to history. I think history is so powerful, and knowing what people endured and the stories of both refusal and survival, which often get in the kind of dominant historical narratives, are often concealed. Again, scholars like Saidiya Hartman, who's at Columbia, who had a new book that came out, talks about the archive and also resuscitating these histories which have been suppressed and concealed in some ways. And I turn to history and to say, with young people and even young children, my daughter is 4 years old. She went to her first, well, not her first, the first protest she'll probably remember days ago. And had to talk to her about different skin colors and why people have been treated differently. I think turning to history and reminding, what did people do? How did they endure? If you think about the history of abolition, you read books like Beloved, even if it's literature, you teach those books, you find those examples and those stories because they exist. And there's so many examples of people who not just survived, they invented in the midst of horrific turmoil, oppression, violence. The history of marionage in the Caribbean, where my family is from, people who ran and created civilizations and worlds. And so I think those examples are powerful right now for helping people understand that what we need, like Happy said, is invention and creativity. And that grief is powerful, but grief is something that you can get through, and something that creativity can help you get through, and expression. So I think hope is strangely sometimes in the past, and to help people and young people see that as a teacher, that is incredibly powerful to bring those examples forward right now, because they don't always know. I mean, today is the commemoration of the Tulsa massacre at Greenwood, what was known as Black Wall Street. And that's not an example I learned about until I was in my late teens. And, I think that we need to teach history more inclusively and more deeply critically than we do.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I had that same conversation with my 21-year-old niece this week when we were disagreeing about the aim of some of the street activity and where we would go next. And she was feeling frustrated in despair and not recognizing that there are past experiences. And, you know, our young people sometimes, you know, want to brush off history. We don't want to live the past. You guys, that's why we're where we are today, because you guys didn't get it done. And so, you know, I reminded her of a couple of examples, including one here in Denver a few years ago when we had a similar, you know, a police saw a young mentally challenged young African-American boy was shot and killed by the police. As a result of that, and I was very much involved because I helped facilitate a year-long discussion that resulted in police oversight, civilian oversight of our police department. It was a long process. Did that solve all of the problems? No. And what I explained to her was we made strides forward with not only civilian oversight, but now a system in our department where we have co-responders from the mental health community that accompany many of our police officers on the street to deal with issues that they confront. Is it the entire solution? No. And it was back to the point that I made earlier. We make successes, each success, then you start all over and there's another journey towards the next level of achievement for addressing these issues. So I said, your generation has to come up with the next change and look back and see that people have made those changes, have made progress. Do we rest in that progress? No. And so now it's your turn to step up and say, what's the next innovation that needs to occur? What's the next systemic change that needs to occur? And hopefully that provides, by looking back, a sense of hope. Changes have occurred and they can going forward. If we use what we bring to the table, we use the strengths and our abilities and our unique ways of thinking and organizing and advocating. These are the skills and the strengths we bring to the table.
Well, thank you both for sharing your insights and being with us today. You know, work like this is difficult, but critical. Wielding power in times of crisis can take many forms, but ultimately it should be used to push society toward equity and justice for all. And speaking of women wielding their power in a crisis, I'd like to give a special shout out to Glory Bell, who you heard from in the beginning. She has been delivering food to frontline workers through her restaurant Barsha in Harlem. Thank you, Glory Bell, and to all Barnard alumni stepping up to help and lead at this time. You're an inspiration for all of us to think about what we can do to help our communities. Thank you again to Seema, Glory Bell, and the entire Alumni of Color Dinner Committee for their work this year. And to our guests, thank you again for joining us. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Here.
Miss seeing you all.